Chalcedon. In 553, they met at Constantinople again in 681. Constantinople again. And in 787 at Nicaea again. So here we have the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ecumenical councils of the church. Then you have a bunch of them throughout the Middle Ages. There's Lyons I, Lyons II, the Council of Florence, Council of Constance, Council of Basel. Several during the Middle Ages, most of which were all not so much concerned with doctrine, what to believe, but trying to reform the morals of the church, which had sunk pretty badly during the Dark Ages. So those are mostly reform councils. And that brings us to the most recent three councils. I'm just going to put a wavy line there for all those medieval ones. The last three have been 1545 to 1563, the Council of Trent. 1869 to 70, which met at the Vatican. That's Vatican I, and 1962 to 1965, the second time the bishops have met at the Vatican. So Vatican II. Now that last one is within our memories, most of us. For a total of 21 times that the bishops have met on the pattern of that initial council back in 49. And just as the bishops back in 49 met in order to deal with a major topic of the day, so that has occurred throughout history. Trent met right after the Protestant Revolution occurred. So this was the Catholic Church's response to Protestantism, its initial response. Vatican II met in order to declare infallibility of the papacy. Vatican II met not primarily because they felt a need to define doctrines, to clarify what we believe, but in order to make the church more effective in the modern world. As John the 23rd said, he wanted aggiornamento, open the windows, get some fresh air. One reason that I'm bringing all this up is I want to show you that you can distinguish the three major branches of Christianity based upon what councils they accept. The three major branches of Christianity are Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. They split off from us in 1054, and Protestant. They split off from us in 1517.
Eastern Orthodox the same as
basically, but I use Eastern Orthodox rather than Greek Orthodox because there are other Orthodox groups, like the Russian Orthodox or the Serbian Orthodox, the Serbs in Bosnianism. So it seems to me Eastern is a preferable term. But yeah, a lot of them practice the Byzantine Rite and so on. So you got these three major branches of Christianity. Just for your curiosity, there's about 200 million Eastern Orthodox in the world today. There's about 1.1 billion Roman Catholics, and there's about 600 million Protestants. So Roman Catholics comprise more than the other two put together. At any rate, you can distinguish the three groups based upon how many councils they accept. We accept all 21. We believe that the Holy Spirit has been working through the bishops in continuity throughout the entire tradition. The Eastern Orthodox, though, broke away in 1054. That would have been right there. And sure enough, Eastern Orthodox accept the first 7 councils, which are the ones that met before they broke off. But all the councils that have met since then, they don't accept. So how many councils do Eastern Orthodox accept? 7. We accept 21. They accept 7. What about Protestants? Mm-hmm. There are 2 or 3 small groups. Oh, not that right, and all that sort of thing. Oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. There are 2 or 3 small groups who broke away when the Eastern Orthodox did in 1054, but at various times in history, mostly within the last 200-300 years, there have been small groups of Eastern Orthodox who have rejoined the Catholic Church. Yeah, pretty much. They're called Uniate churches. That's right. Yeah. And a lot of times they have received permission to retain the particular rite that they were using, which had evolved somewhat differently from the one that you and I attend on Sunday.
Well, when I was growing up for a full week in January, priests would come in into our Catholic church. And there's many more Catholics who went to masses in different Protestants.
They were probably those unions, would be my guess. There's Meliborese rite, there's Melkite rite, there's several of these. Yeah. There's the Ambrosian rite, which is from Spain, I think. At any rate, Protestants. Martin Luther, when he revised Christianity, took a look at all this and said, well, which ones do I want to keep? And basically, he decided to draw the line right here. He noticed that these first 2 had to do with the doctrine of the Incarnation. Oh, excuse me, I got that wrong. These 2 had to do with the doctrine of the Trinity. Luther had already decided to continue believing in the Trinity, so he wanted to retain those councils as authoritative. These 2, he noticed, had to do with the Incarnation. He had already decided to continue believing in the Incarnation, so he wanted to retain those 2 as authoritative to support that doctrine. But all of those since then were eliminated. Consequently, this one here, the 7th Ecumenical Council, got rejected in Protestantism. That's kind of an interesting one. That council met because an emperor had been elected emperor of the Roman Empire, and he thought that it was a bad thing for people to use sensory aids when they worship God. Sensory aids when you worship God. I don't know about you, but I've got some holy cards at home. I have a rosary. I love statues in churches. I love all those gaudy colors that the priests wear. All of these sensory aids, I think, are wonderful. But this emperor got elected, and he thought that that was terrible because God is immaterial, and therefore we ought to worship him only as spiritual beings and not with our senses. Well, he sent his armies into all the churches, and they started smashing all the statues. They were called iconoclasts. Here's the word icon, and klasmos means to break. So these were the breakers of the icons, the statues and the pictures and that sort of thing. So naturally, all the bishops got upset. They had a big meeting. Some of the bishops, of course, for political reasons, sided with the emperor, but they got voted down. And at this council, the church as a whole said, relax, there's nothing wrong with using sensory aids. Candles, incense, pour it on. The more the better, in my opinion. I love really gaudy churches. I used to go to a Polish church that had nothing but retirees in it, in Madison, Wisconsin. It was wonderful. Everywhere you look, some new little detail to see. The fact that this decision got rejected by Protestantism is one reason why, when you walk into a Protestant church, you don't see these days. If you have stained glass windows, you're as likely as not to have geometric patterns. And what about the crucifix hanging in front? There isn't one. There's a cross. You know why? Why isn't there the corpus hanging on the cross? Because that's sensory. At any rate, these are ecumenical councils, and these are the continuation of the root that we see planted back here in 49 AD. I'm emphasizing them to some extent because I want to emphasize the principle of tradition. You know, it's not the case that God established Christianity and helped people get the New Testament written up until 125, and then basically folded his arms and said, okay, that's it. You're on your own now. I gave you the New Testament. Get out there and do what you can. I don't believe that. I believe the Holy Spirit is just as active in our lives right now as he was in the early church. And that continuity of tradition between them and us should be something that's emphasized. Okay. Yes?
Martin Luther didn't really start Protestantism. He died in Catholic.
I don't believe that's true.
I thought it was Calvin and some of the other ones at that time that actually started Protestantism.
No, I don't think so. Luther started it in 1517. He died in 1545, and he had established a bunch of Lutheran churches, never returned to Catholicism.
He was silent, but I don't think he ever left Catholicism.
Oh, he claims not to have left it. He claims that he got kicked out. But, on the other hand, he had rejected a lot of what Catholicism believed. So, he wanted to retain the name without retaining the substance. So, I'm sure on his deathbed he would have claimed that he was still a good Catholic. But, he had a whole bunch of churches that were following him rather than following the Catholic Church. It becomes a matter of semantics, I suppose. But certainly he never returned to the Catholic Church in the sense of made submission to the Pope or anything of that sort. Anyway, let's return to the New Testament period. After 49, Paul is free to continue his missionary efforts. Up until this point, we don't know of any writings that he may have created. Although he had already been a missionary for several years. But we do know that starting in 51, Paul began writing letters to his churches. Many of these were saved, and we have them in our New Testament today. Obviously, obviously, Paul did not continue writing letters after he died. So the question becomes, when did he die? Well, the book of Acts doesn't say. The book of Acts ends with Paul still alive and living in Rome. Instead, what we have to do is turn to a book that I mentioned last time, written in 96. It's a book called First Clement. And it was written by the fourth pope, whose name was Clement. In that year, he wrote a letter to the Corinthian church. And incidentally, in one of the many chapters in this letter, it's quite a long letter, he happens to mention that Paul and Peter both were martyred under Nero. You've heard about the persecution that occurred under Nero. Probably. Nero was emperor in the early 60s and got in trouble with the populace because there was a big fire in Rome. In Rome at that time, there was a section of town that was all wooden tenements, kind of the poor section of town. These tenements were 3 or 4 stories high, we know from Roman historians. They were packed in like orange crates, really tight. Consequently, when a fire started one night in that section of town, it roared its way through all of these tenements, and it left many, many thousands of poor Romans homeless. Nero could have cared less. When people rushed to him in court and said, the poor section of town is on fire, he said, who cares? It's just the poor people. And so he refused to call out the fire department. I kid you not, there was a fire department in Rome back then. Horse-drawn, water tanks, and the whole bit. And he refused to call it out. Well, word of this fact that he refused to call out the fire department spread among the poor people, and they were starting to riot. So Nero decided that he had better figure out some kind of a scapegoat to divert the attention from the anger of the populace toward himself onto these scapegoats. I don't know that he asked his advisors, but I can imagine him saying to them, come on guys, give me a scapegoat. Who do you think we should use here? And somebody said, what about these Christians or something like that? There's this weird new group in town. Everybody thinks they're strange. Why don't you blame it on them? And that's exactly what Nero did. He went out and announced to the populace that the Christians had set the fire and that it was their fault. And sure enough, it worked. Everybody went and started attacking the Christians. So you have your very first systematic persecution of Christians. We know that Nero died in 68. And we know that the fire was around 64. Consequently, if Paul and Peter died during the Neronian persecution, as First Clement tells us, and hey, it was written in 96, I mean, he probably had good evidence for it, then that means that the death of Peter and Paul both must have been somewhere around 64 to 67. And consequently, Paul's letters cannot date from after that time. So scholars usually say that the period during which Paul's letters were written is around 51 to 63. It's only after Paul's letters are written that we start to get the Gospels written. That's kind of odd. The Gospels come first in the New Testament, and then you get Paul's letters. The Gospels have to do with Jesus, who lived around 30. The letters are like Paul, having to do with the 50s and 60s. Isn't it odd that Paul's letters were written first in the 50s and 60s, and the Gospels were all written later, after Paul had died? The dates for the Gospels, here as we can figure, are these. 65 to 70, Mark's Gospel was written. 85 or so. Matthew was written. 90. Luke's Gospel was written. And during the 90s, John's Gospel was written. So Mark is 65 to 70, Matthew is 85, Luke is 90, and John is 90 to 100. You had your hand up.
The gentleman next to me answered my question.
Oh, okay, great. Why did it take them so long to get around to writing the Gospels? You would have thought that they put that stuff down as soon as Jesus had ascended, right? Why do you think they maybe didn't? I mean, what possible reasons can you think of for why they might not have bothered to write down Jesus' sayings and deeds?
They were out preaching. They were out trying to convert people.
That's a good point. He had just told them to get out there and...
Go do it.
Yeah. So they were busy. That's a good point.
I
Yeah.
thought Jesus was coming back, too.
Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it right there. Everybody assumed in the early church that the second coming was going to be any day. Do you remember that subsection of Paul's letters called the early letters? 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Remember Paul's letters were subdivided into 6 subcategories? If you read those early letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which Paul wrote back here around 51, you can see that he believes that Jesus is going to show up any day. And even in Mark, written in 65 to 70, there's a fair amount of expectation that the second coming is going to be any month. Once you get to Matthew, he's sort of not so sure. Sometimes he'll indicate that he thinks it's going to be soon. Other times he'll indicate that there may be some delay. By the time you get to Luke, Luke has sort of lost his expectation that the second coming will be soon. It's already been 60 years. Luke thinks that probably Jesus intends the church to continue on for quite some time. He's not definite about how long, but he sort of sees it stretching indefinitely into the future. So you can actually trace the fervor of the earliest Christians in the New Testament writings and the gradual dying out of that expectation that it was going to be any day.
They must have been getting very old when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at that time, must have been quite elderly. Is there any way, do you know how old they were to begin with?
Well, let's think about that. That's a good question. If Jesus was born in 4 BC, how old was he when he died in 33? If he picked his disciples at the beginning of his public ministry in 28, then how old were they likely to have been? Maybe around his age. On the other hand, they might have been a bit younger, right? I mean, they're disciples, he's the master. Just to be conservative, let's say that they're 20 when they get called, on average. Let's presume, well, what the heck, let's really give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they're 20 and 30. That way our math will be a lot easier. Just guess that they're 20 years old when they're 30. That's not such an odd guess, because people got married very early back then. Joseph and Mary were probably mid-teenagers and all that sort of thing. You've all heard this. And they all died early. Very true. Do you know, what's the average age of a male in America right now? 75, something like that. Do you realize that 98 years ago, in 1900, the average age of a male in America was 45? Isn't that incredible? Just because we're born now, we can live 2 lifetimes. That's amazing. That's wonderful.
But what?
Speak for yourself. But what about ancient Palestine? What about 2,000 How long did the average male live? 33 is the average age of death. Well, but to say that the average age of death was 33 means half of the males lived longer than 33. And if you made it to 33, there was some decent chance you're going to last a fair amount of time. You know, a lot of the early age would result in infant mortality, which is very high. So I'm trying to be as conservative as possible here. Let's assume that they're 20 in 30 and that they beat the odds, that they lived to be ripe old men. Well, how old would that make them down here? If you're 20 and 30 and here it is 70, how old would you be? 50, right? If you're 20 and 30 and it's now 85, it had to subtract 10 years, right? That's the difference between 20 and 30. So that makes you 75. Luke, 90, would be 80. And John, in the 90s, let's use 95, would make him 85. Yeah, that's pretty old. That's really stretching it.
Yeah, but Elijah was old, and Moses and Abraham, all the elders of the Bible would just be in the 80s and 90s. They'd just be old. So God's people got to be old.
Either that, or because they lived so long, therefore they stuck around to be God's people and become famous by changing. Could work both ways. Now that's another thing. I was just going to bring that up. Plus, two of these authors are not apostles, right? Matthew and John were apostles, but Mark and Luke weren't. Mark was a young guy who was the nephew of Barnabas. Remember Barnabas? He was the guy that went up to Jerusalem in 49 with Paul. And he's a nephew of Barnabas, so he's somewhat younger than Paul. And Paul is probably about the age of the other disciple. Luke was a traveling companion of Paul's. So they're not necessarily of the same generation as the apostles themselves. Nevertheless, it is true that these men to be the authors of those Gospels would have been pretty old. Yeah?
Well, wasn't a possible reason why they would have written the Gospels down later, like you said, they were being older, was that the early church actually had living witnesses to Christ.
Excellent point.
Whereas when they were getting older, these people were dying. And so they wanted to leave a legacy of their witness to Christ in a writing, such as the gospel.
Yeah, now doesn't that make good sense? Sure. They had living memory. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Living memory. While I'm alive, my memory's alive. And if you want to know about the 60s, hey, come talk to me. I'll be happy to tell you. I have living memories of the 60s. But I don't have living memories of World War I. Do we have any soldiers still alive in World War I? Do we? How old must they be? If you were 17 in 1917, you'd be 98 now. Yeah, I guess we probably have a fair number still around. Will we in 25 years? In 50 years? 0. There'll be none left. So that's dead memory. And from then on till the end of time, everything that anybody is ever going to know about World War I has to rely upon whatever documentary evidence is left that they left. So I think you make an excellent point. As the apostles are starting to die off, the last ones to still be around that you could go ask, then it becomes more and more imperative that we get things down on paper. Well, after the writing of Paul's letters and the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, by the way, 1 Clement tells us that when Paul was martyred in Rome, the method of martyrdom was beheading. A sword whacked his head off. When Peter was martyred in Rome, we're told that the method was crucifixion, and that Peter requested to be crucified upside down, so that he wouldn't have the same method of death as his Lord. more major occurrence during the New Testament period. The other New Testament books, of course, start coming into existence down to about 125. We've already mentioned that. I want to conclude tonight by referring to a couple of heresies that got going during the New Testament times. And there are traces of the battle that the church did with these heresies in some of the later New Testament writings. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, heresy means deviation from the beliefs of the Catholic Church. That's the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. Consequently, heresies that we're referring to here toward the end of the 1st century AD were deviations from what most of the Christians believed back then. However, the word is used more broadly nowadays. We can talk about Hindus who consider other Hindus heretics and that sort of thing. So if we use the word broadly, it simply means the beliefs of a minority that deviate from the majority. It's a bit broader use of the term. But either way, we're talking here about deviation from what most Catholics believed back here in the last decades of the 1st century. A couple of the heresies had to do with this doctrine, the doctrine of incarnation. Incarnation is a term which has as its root C-A-R-N. What does carn mean? Well, ever heard of chili con carne? What's that carne refer to? Meat. Yeah, so the incarnation means the appearing of God. Well, ever heard of chili con carne? What's that carne refer to? Meat. Yeah, so the incarnation means the appearing of God as meat, as a three-dimensional human being. That's the incarnation. And the term emphasizes flesh and blood. That this was how God chose to manifest himself. Not as God appearing to be a human being, but as a human being. Well, that's a pretty weird concept when you stop and think about it. I know we affirm it every Sunday at Mass when we say the Creed and so on. But when you stop and think about it, it becomes more and more difficult to understand how that could possibly be the case. We are affirming, and we Catholics believe, that this one being was completely God. But we also affirm at the same time that this one being was also a complete human being. Everything that a human being has, Jesus had. Do you have calluses on your toes? Yes. Jesus had calluses on his toes. Do you thirst? Sure, Jesus thirsted. Do you have memories? He had memories. Do you have imaginings? He had imaginings. Do you have a will that you can make free choices with? Then Jesus had a will that he could make, because Jesus was a complete human being. Everything that a human being has, he had. But at the same time, he was also completely God. Now, what are the characteristics of God? Well, God is immaterial, purely spiritual. So, on the one hand, we affirm that Jesus had a nature that was purely immaterial. On the other, we affirm that he had a nature which was enfleshed, an animated body, which is what a human being is. God is omniscient. God knows everything. If Jesus had a complete divine nature, then God knew everything. But at the same time, he was a complete human being, and a human being doesn't know everything. So simultaneously, Jesus knew everything and didn't know everything. God is eternal. A human being is not. God is infinite. A human being is not. God is completely simple, not composed of parts. A human being is composed of light. So am I. The image that I get in my head when I think about this doctrine of the incarnation, where we assert that Jesus was both completely God and completely human, is bar magnets. You know what bar magnets are? They're those rectangles that look like metal. They are metal, made of iron. Flat rectangles, and they're polarized so that you have the negative pole at one end and the positive pole at the other. And the image that I get is of two of these bar magnets, and you put the two poles that are alike toward each other. And the more you try to push them together, the harder it gets. And the more they tend to want to shoot away from each other. That's what it's like when you try to think of this one entity as being both divine but also completely human. Ultimately, you can't do it. It's a mystery. Well, some of the early Christians decided not to do it. They denied that Jesus was completely God and completely man. Some of the early Christians opted to say that he was only a human being, that he was not God. My suspicion is that these were probably converts from Judaism, because I would imagine that Jews would have an especially hard time believing that any human being could be God. The technical term for their position, for their heresy, is adoptionism. We call it that because according to them, Jesus was born and raised like any human being, but he was an exceptionally good man. And because he was such an upright and moral and righteous person, once he was fully grown, God adopted him as his adopted son. He's not God's son in the sense that he's God in the flesh, but he's adopted to be God's special child. And that's why this is called adoptionism. This is one of the misunderstandings of Christianity that the early Christians had to fight against. There were other Christians who went to the other side. Since they could not force the two bar magnets together, they said he wasn't human. He only appeared to be a human being. But actually, it was just God. God made you think that there was a human being. Suppose that I'm Jesus, and here it is the afternoon that I'm delivering the Sermon on the Mount. As I deliver the Sermon on the Mount, you're all sitting out there on the grass, listening to me saying, love your enemies, judge not, all the wonderful things that are being said. You think that you see a human being up here. You think that you see lips move. You think that you see hand gestures. But it's not true. Because I'm God, and therefore all-powerful, I can very easily, with no effort at all, cause all of you to believe that there's a human being standing here when there isn't one. What you're actually doing is looking straight through the nose. And I can easily cause her to see me from this angle, and her to see me from that angle, and her to see me from that angle. No sweat, I'm omnipotent. This theory concerning Jesus, this heresy, was known as Docetism. This comes from a Greek word Dokein, D-O-K-E-I-N. Dokein means to seem or to appear. So really, when you say Docetism, you're saying seemism. This is the theory of seemism. That Jesus seemed to be a human being, but actually there was only one nature there, and that's the divine. As we get into some of the later New Testament writings, we'll want to notice occasional traces of these two heresies concerning the incarnation